capturing an email address and a couple registration questions is one thing. But if you want to think a whole lot more strategically about data and intelligence when it comes to webinars and virtual event programs and even hybrid, today's Thought Leader Conversation is for you. Well, hello and welcome to Intelligence Strategy for Virtual Event Programs. My name is Roger Courville, and welcome to another of V2's Thought Leader Conversations series. And, unless this is your first one of these that you've watched, you know that we really hope to help you dial in what it is that you do, both with regard to your purpose and use case and the platform that's going to help you get there. And of course, we know that assuming you want to go beyond the basics, one of the best brains on the planet is V2's co-founder and CEO, Aaron Cole. Welcome back to the virtual stage.
Hey, Roger. It's great to see you.
You know, I'm going to make an assumption that people realize, because everybody's at least attended, if not done, a webinar, right? And we're really talking about taking it beyond that. You can go customize a registration question and you can get a report at the end and see who attended and who didn't. But when we use the term intelligence, where do we even start with that? What do you mean by intelligence, and why would we even care?
Yeah, great starting question. I think it even actually helps to go back even just a little bit higher and just kind of reface the known fact of the world we live in, which is that we live in a data-driven world, and everyone knows that. Everyone gets the pop-up recommendations for things on Amazon you might like to buy, or the next Netflix event that you might, or show that you might want to binge. All of that is data-driven. And it's no different in terms of what we do for a living in terms of online events and virtual events compared to, again, some other company that's gathering your data based on what your spending privilege or your spending tendencies tend to be. That creates a large pile of data. And so where we are at right now is thinking through and coming up with ways to get actionable with the data that you're gathering. And that, from our standpoint, can be in terms of from a basic idea of lead scoring to an idea of coming up with ways to better couch and present material that speakers or attendees might be interested in following up on, for example. All of that is taking the data and making it work for you. And that is really where we start to talk about being smart with your data. So that really is kind of like where that data intelligence idea starts. You've got the data. You should have the data. You're gathering the data. Be smart with it and start thinking through, how can I make that data work appropriately and the best possible way for me and what I'm doing.
And, if just in case you're kind of newer to our series here, really the goal isn't you should do business with V2, even though we would love it if you do. Our goal here today is information in a way that equips you to think more strategically. So we'll talk about not just the life cycle of what you can do in a webinar, but maybe even how it's different when you think in terms of series of events, the things that you can do in series that you can't do in individual events, ways to think about gathering additional intelligence, maybe that your platform doesn't gather. We'll talk about security and tech integrations and GDPR. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the human side of that, right? How to work with others, right? How do we work with our moderator or speakers or producers in a way that really helps you get out of the silo, or give you a tactic or two for how to break down some of those silos in a way that is really powerful. And I've got at least one, I trust, really cool little case study that we'll get to at that point. So, Aaron, why the importance of data? You just commented on the fact that it's there and it's going to increase. Any additional things on why this should even be part of someone's strategy? Why is it worth their time in the middle of a busy schedule to think about the kinds of things that help the decision support, help them be more strategic within their organization?
Yeah. Another great question. So data, the way we look at it is data drives everything, and it can provide excuse me, a wealth of information on what your audience is doing, what they might be receptive to, what they might not like, what they might want to hear more about. All of those are things that, as you and us as marketers, as promoters, we have to understand our audience. We have to understand who we're trying to connect with and what is going to resonate with them. One of the things I know that we've talked about, Roger, a lot in our conversations here is it's really one of the most important things we look at is making sure that the content, the message of the event, whatever it happens to be, if it's a webinar or a 2-day series or whatever it happens to be, that message is what is the most important part to be adequately delivered. Understanding how that message is received and what that feedback is back from the audience is kind of like that completion of that feedback loop almost, where you're then being able to take actionable steps based on the feedback that you receive. You know, if you're running a yearly conference, for example, it is very much a circular process where you do the event, you're done with the event, you take a break, you analyze the data, and you almost immediately start planning to the next year's event, ideally with some of the insights and the knowledge that you've gained from the data that you've gathered. So long story long, it really is to your benefit to get really smart and think about the data that you're gathering, how best to gather it, and what that data is, obviously, but then how to use it and find ways that you can actually even potentially segment out audiences, potentially do lead scoring from a very basic standpoint, from a sales driven kind of a pipeline standpoint, and really start applying that to what you're doing with the business. I can't think of a single business or organization that would not benefit from understanding their market better. And that's really what this boils down to. That's really what it provides you.
Yeah, it it hurts my heart when I work with a client and I ask how this is going to be used. Oh yeah, we're going to upload it into salesforce.com, and their version of that is a name and an email address. And
Yeah.
trust me, I'm not wanting to diss on anybody, but okay, we got a marketing qualified lead. Now they're in this big old bucket, and they're just going to get the follow up, sequence that's triggered or something like that. When you just mentioned the importance of data related to that circular or cycle of feedback, and I'm thinking, a lot of people here are copywriters, or they understand the value of copywriting and how sometimes a small word tweak can make a big difference in terms of how people respond. Well, you may or may not be able to change the topic of today's webinar, but there's one example of going, well, but are we going to learn something here that increases our registration rate or attendance rate or whatever for the next webinar? And that's just talking about a single webinar feeding into the next one.
Right.
So let's talk through like the event life cycle for a single event. For the sake of discussion, we'll call it a virtual event or a webinar, but let's get beyond the obvious. We can get registration data. We can ask some questions, and some platforms allow you to customize a registration question. And before I even move on, I'm maybe just going to throw this out because we're just having a cup of coffee and talking about it. To me, that is one of the most overlooked opportunities, right? If you've ever spent money trying to survey your market or your audience, you know how much money and effort you spend trying to drive traffic to SurveyMonkey or something like that. If you've already got somebody at your registration page for your webinar, what's one question that you could ask that you'd be delighted to have data for, right?
Yep.
But then attendance rate, chat, polls, post-event surveys.
Yeah.
What are those things through that life cycle that you see, Aaron, that where people tend to like underutilize or just leave money on the table?
Yeah, there's a lot there. It first starts obviously with registration, just like you mentioned. That's the start of any kind of a cycle that we're going to do. You do want to be thoughtful in thinking through what demographic fields you're gathering from a registration page, number one, because one of the things you want to do is it in I know we're going to talk about the cross collaboration between other groups, sales group,
Oh, just
things
let
like
her
that,
rip. We're
all
just
those
talking.
things. You want to make sure that you're including their guidance in that. And sales might come to you and say, yes, I need to know this demographic, I need to know that. You need to think through that, because there is a proven correlation between the number of data fields that you are asking a potential registrant to put in compared to how many people are actually going to go through that process versus give up and not attend your event. So you do want to make sure that you are gathering the data that you need, number one, but not necessarily everything under the sun just to fill your database. And that can also be looked at from a CRM standpoint. One of the things I know we're going to talk about is integrating your data so that it's not siloed in any one place or webinar platform. So making sure it's homogeneous and it matches your CRM data is obviously another part of it. But thinking that through from the beginning, I think is a very big start. The other thing I would say too, Roger, I totally agree with you in terms of that value of that question on the reg page. They've bought in, they're going to register, they're going to hit the register button, they know what they're going to do. And so it's like, why not ask a couple more questions there? We're not asking them to fill out a huge litany of things, but ask them what you need to know there, and you might be surprised with what you get back. Another thing that just real quickly that we see a lot of that I think is very cool is even keeping it open-ended. What questions would you like answered in this webinar? Or what questions would you like to have the speakers address? You're not going to get everybody answer that question, but I think you would be surprised. You might get some very, very good feedback from people on what they are wanting to hear from, or what they're expecting to be covered in this webinar. That might even go so far as to help drive the design of what you're looking to deliver within that specific event itself. So
You know what?
I think that's big too.
I'll jump in with this. I know we were going to touch this a little bit later, but let me run with that for a moment. To me, qualitative data is one of those really overlooked opportunities, right? Mm-hmm. We think in terms of quantitative data, what percentage registered and attended versus how many people would have clicked yes versus no in the poll. But all the awesome platforms let you capture what came in Q&A. Yeah. And to Aaron's point about asking an open-ended question, particularly with today's tools like open ChatGPT or some other tools with AI. I mean, we used to just run and take all that stuff because I'd speak at a big event, it's 800 people there, there's 2,000 questions asked, and we'd run it into a word cloud just to see what started popping up. But what do you learn when you ask questions that are outside of the quantitative?
Yes.
And being purposeful about saying, do we have a strategy for using that qualitative data, either for what we learn or what we give to the sales team? And we'll come back to that as a case study.
Right.
Other things throughout the life cycle.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I love word clouds because that visual representation of what people are talking about or what's resonating, it's just one of those brilliant ideas. I don't even know who came up with that first, but it's a very, very powerful way to possibly look at your data from a different angle and very quickly visually pick out what is relevant to a population. It's very cool stuff. So when we're in an event, so we've talked about registration, again, thinking through what you're asking and asking it and feeling the liberty to ask those questions that you think are going to prompt that meaningful response and that meaningful dialogue, quantitative versus qualitative. When you're in the event itself, I think that same strategy also can reap benefits in the form of polling questions or in Q&A questions. We almost always are working with our presenters to come up with seed questions. And a lot of times, if we have gathered attendee comments in the registration page that clue us into what at least a portion of the audience is looking to learn about or something, we can come up with some fairly good seed questions that are going to address those questions or topics if they haven't already been brought up from an audience member, during the Q&A session. So even that's another good way to kind of hone in on the data and be very smart about it. Even things like group chat. I'm pretty interested in the way group chat functions, not necessarily from a standpoint of reading every single comment that's coming in, and policing that and watching that. But it's very interesting to watch to what degree group chat is being used during an event. I think that you would very easily see there's a fairly good correlation between the number of volume of chats directly proportional to the engagement of the audience that's on the online event. And so even just anecdotally looking at what's going on in the chat window, having it up, number one, and having it be something that you're encouraging people to use would be a part of that, obviously, to start with. But even anecdotally, just looking at the volume of information and comments that are coming back to you can help you to lead a better understanding of what's resonating with your audience, or maybe what's not resonating with your audience if it's crickets out there and you've got nothing out there.
I just happened, because of my background in presenter training, that's actually, to me, you just give me goosebumps. And here's a geek data point for you. In 2011, Twitter teamed up with Nielsen, the television rating organization, and their investigation looked at what people did while they're watching television, meaning people are watching television and multitasking. What are they doing? Right. Yeah. And one of the big, and this is a decade old, so take it with a grain of salt, but one of the biggest things that they found was that there was a form of community and we're talking Twitter here, there's a form of community of people all tweeting on the same hashtag. And now I'm interacting with a community of people that I don't know because we're all tweeting on the hashtag Super Bowl. Super Bowl 49 or whatever whatever that was. And so I think that room is buzzing activity is peer-to-peer connection that is sometimes overlooked, to your point.
Yeah. Yep. I do too. And I do think also that same kind of an idea, you can also apply that just to even the questions. It's very common. And again, it's kind of like reading the room, the thing that we all learn from a public speaking standpoint of watching, engaging your audience. If you're getting questions in, that's a good sign. If you're not getting questions in, and if it's crickets again in the room, that's a very, very clear, unmistakable signal that your audience is giving you about what they're perceiving the value of your content is, and also how they're spending their time. And we all know how painfully we've learned that online audiences can be very fickle. It is seconds away for them to click on a tab and to multitask or pull up their email or whatever, way easier than it is actually to stand up and actually walk out of a room if you're actually physically at, an expo somewhere or something like that. It's a brutal audience. And so that's why it's that much more important to do.
I'm going to expand on one of the thing you mentioned a little bit earlier, just because I think you implied it without stating it explicitly. And I just want to make sure we put an exclamation point behind this. When you were talking about registration data, particularly if you talk to the sales team, say, hey, what data would you like? And they'll give you a list that's longer than you're ever going to put on a registration page. But here's a strategy for you. And Aaron just implied this with regard to thinking through the things that are beyond the registration page. If you start with a list, maybe in a spreadsheet, of all of the data points that you'd love to know about a given prospect or whoever is going to be attending your event, customers, then you prioritize which ones you want to go on the registration page. Maybe that's only the top couple, because more people are going to register than attend. But you start thinking about those other data points that you'd like, and you start thinking about how I'm going to make sure that the moderator or MC asks a question that elicits that kind of information in chat, or maybe you work with the presenter to ask a poll that gets integrated in there, because now all that gets tied back to that individual's profile. And now you can begin to think about how you, end of event survey clearly as well, you can think about how to get deeper levels of profiling on someone beyond just that registration page.
Right.
And, but that's thinking strategically, starting with a plan, going, here's not only the data that I want and need, but now how am I going to get it over the life cycle of an event? And before we turn that to, well, what does that mean when we think about events plural, like a whole program, and what can you do differently? Aaron, something you said before we push the record button here kind of struck me, which is about choosing what data you want as opposed to just spray and pray and gathering anything possible. Care to elaborate on that? I may have. No. You didn't say spray and pray, but I see plenty of marketing that kind of looks like that.
That's a good term. That fits. That fits. Yeah. No, I think you need to. I think you need to always be conscious of that. And and you've alluded to the biggest reason for that. Obviously, is that the more you're looking to gather from someone, the less likely it is that they're actually going to go all the way through. Our first goal is to get, the other marketing term, butts in seats. We want to convert registration, and then we want to get registration converted to attendance. And so all of that is the end goal. So that's probably one of the bigger things. But I do think it also, you can look at it from a holistic standpoint, which is when you are, to your point, thinking about creating not just a data set on someone that's first name, last name, email, and attended, didn't attend, length of time in the event, but you are looking to build out that larger data set on individuals, so that that's where you can start getting smarter and more actionable with the data and the questions they asked. How did they ask polling? How did they vote on polling? What did they indicate their interests are? Things like that you can start predicting and start coming up with ideas to segment out that population, and even potentially use tools that can help provide insights in what they might be receptive to. That's how you start building that information and that data flow up. And the other thing we haven't really talked about that I think is almost like another rail of our world, that I think is only going to increase, is that on a personal level, people are becoming more and more cognizant of the value of your data personally, and being more cognizant of where that data is and where it's stored and how it might be used and all of that. There's no doubt that there's a value of your own data profile, and the recognition of that. And then the flip side of that, the control of that, is even also another thing that we should probably touch on, because that also starts to affect what you are doing. And you need to have that in at least the back of your mind, in terms of thinking through, what are you going to be doing with the data, and how are you going to be using it? And again, are you really only collecting that data that you need, and you're not doing the spray and pray to just gather everything, because that's likely going to be something that maybe at least some people are going to start taking issue with. And the final point I would make about that too is that when we're talking about being more actionable and smart with your data, almost kind of like an end goal of that too is thinking through and coming up ways to take that knowledge of that data of that individual or that group set, and applying that back to that group set in the form of meaningful experiences or targeted information that they're going to appreciate you're sending to them. And so there's no difference when, to that analogy of like getting served up, what Amazon might think you might like to buy based on your purchase history. You're more likely to be receptive to that if it's actually meaningful to you as a person. And so if your audience, over the time that you have your relationship with them, they start to understand that it's a two-way street. They're choosing to share their information with you, but they're getting back some pretty cool stuff that actually is relevant to my job and to my interests and stuff. That's a relationship that you're building. And that becomes much more valuable all the way across the board.
Oh, get me excited. Say the word relationship, because you're right. It's about trust, right?
It is.
I don't want to give you something if I don't trust you,
Right.
but to the degree that you earn my trust and you're useful with that, we realize that there is a quid pro quo. So before we get to like tech security and GDPR, regulations, we'll get there right after this. But before we leave the life cycle of an event, I wanted to talk about the life cycle of a program. Like if we're talking about a whole series, or the utilization of the follow-up recordings is going to be all part of a single program, right? Sometimes you know as well as I do that there's an event and then there's a recording that they post on YouTube, but nary the twain shall meet. And the reason I just want to make sure we touch on that, because is that there are some things that you can only do when you look at things over time, over multiple events.
Right.
And I'm just curious, is there a particular point or two with regard to series or whole programs that sticks out for you as I keep saying leaving money on the table, but places that are often overlooked?
Yeah, it totally. It is a longer runway that you have when you're talking about, marketing and developing data sets over a series compared to like single webinar events that you might be running. And really that just presents an opportunity for you to get more and more and more meaningful, actionable data that's coming from the audience. That absolutely can impact the degree that you feel like you need to gather, all of the actionable data on the very first event, for example, compared to gradually accumulating that data based on, their involvement in subsequent events that you're looking to do. But you're looking to build on that. You're looking to grow that. And it is also something that you can build upon from participation data as well as demographic data. That whole idea that you mentioned a minute ago, Roger, about the sum of the data versus the actual quality of that data that you're actually gathering. What is that data telling you? And being able to look at things, for example, of how people are voting on polling questions over a life cycle of an event series, for example, basing those questions, on the event and on what people are voting on, how they're voting, I should say, that can be fairly powerful. It doesn't change the end goal. I want to state that your end goal does not change. Your end goal is still, I need and I want to understand my audience better so that I can turn this into a two-way street and provide actionable, meaningful information back to that audience so that they want to come back. And then it's that again, quid pro quo. That doesn't change. It's just that when you have series or longer engagements, you have a longer runway to build that up, still with the same goal in mind, though.
I probably should have said this at the outset, but it doesn't take very long. Today, by nature of what we're talking about, is going to have to be slightly generic, because we're talking about some people doing marketing, some people doing all hands events, or whatever that might be, right? And this starts to get really personal really quickly, which means that it's useful to actually talk with somebody who's, like Aaron, he'll take your phone call and begin to drill in. Because when I think of like series and I'll just kind of go rapid fire, to me, there are some places where you get to loosen up. Instead of every event being exactly the same, maybe you have different events that are now more specifically targeted in terms of the topic and speakers and et cetera, based on the segment of the life cycle of the customer purchasing life cycle that you want, right? What kind of events do you do for like putting people in the top of the funnel versus if it's a later stage, well-developed lead, and there are content differences,
right?
Stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 lead versus just kind of like you think about marketing qualified lead versus sales qualified lead. Do you produce different webinars for people in different stages? You can see trends over time. When I was a kid, I worked in retail like lots of kids do. And I remember one of my managers eons ago actually took notes on anything exceptional that happened. Oh, last year, we did a blowout day, or we had a really bad day. And then in the margin, it might say, yeah, we had a snowstorm, right? I've seen the same kind of thing with webinar series where it's like, hey, on average, I'm getting, 36% people attending. Whoa, why? How come I got 46% people attend?
Right.
Was it the topic? Was it the day? Was there a news item or something like that?
Right.
And
Right.
those little insights only happen if you're thinking about the overall program, let alone the optimization that drives valuation that we mentioned earlier, which is, hey, what did I learn in terms of tweaking my topic so that next, what do I learn from this one that helps me get to the next one? There are still some things that you only see in aggregate. When you look at aggregate data, here's all 27 events we did in this last quarter. Oh, and here's then the recording data.
Yep. Totally.
And it all gets summed up in a single place. And, you've got to be purposeful about gathering it, collecting it, and then going from data to intelligence to knowledge to the wisdom or the ability for you to turn around and use that to offer advice to the people that are signing the checks and giving you budget because you want to increase your program or something like that.
Exactly. And there's a lot of tools out there, that's a whole exploding universe almost in terms of tools and programs that can help marketers and producers and people to provide and to come up with actionable data. That does go back to a little bit, again, we were talking about the importance of not siloing your data, or what I mean by that is not just letting it sit in WebEx or On24 or whatever and just having it be there. Finding ways to get it out so that it can become a part of the larger ecosystem when you're building out those profiles. But it's pretty remarkable what some of these tools can generate from a actionable standpoint about your audiences when you're looking to segment, when you're looking to obviously deliver value back to them in the form of content or archives or whatever it happens to be. So there are definitely tools, and we do help a lot of people as they are beginning to think about my data life cycle and how does it work and how do I really want to get smart with this. We do help people kind of think through that process, and it is something you need to spend some time kind of diagnosing and then developing. And obviously there's a technical part of that from an API or integration standpoint, depending on what you're looking to do. But there's a lot of cool stuff out there.
That's a killer transition and the reason I kind of put GDPR, regulatory, and security, data security, and then tech and integrations kind of in one big bucket. And I know it's a really broad umbrella, but I put them there because they all kind of are very interrelated, right? One of the things that we haven't mentioned here is that one thing that we sometimes do is work with people to say, hey, if that's the kind of data that you want, that doesn't happen in Zoom webinar, but it happens in On24 or something like that. Do you have the liberty to change platforms? Or there are even uses of external tools to help you get the things that you want, but we've got to know what you want to begin with. But then that often comes back, particularly for the, those high security, high stakes kind of verticals that we often are serving: banking, finance, medical, legal, that kind of thing, let alone, country or regional regulations like either GDPR or California's security requirements. Just out of curiosity, maybe we start there. What's the state of the state with regard to security and legal requirements?
Ever evolving, like it's going to, and ever becoming more and more prevalent in our industry. And it is, again, common themes in our society, in our world, obviously impact everything that rides above that. We're no different. And so GDPR, excuse me, is obviously, or was obviously, excuse me, was obviously a sea change in terms of recognizing and forcing businesses to recognize what their obligations are and still are from a data management and a data privacy standpoint. And that has led to, again, you just mentioned the California, the California Privacy Protection Act. I think that one was pushed out in 2018, and then there's another one, the American Data Privacy and Protection Act is another one that came out as well too recently. All of those are designed around privacy and the value of owning your data. It's my understanding, if we're talking and going back to GDPR, in terms of GDPR, what it did in terms of how it became important and what it provided was essentially it really codified into law the idea that you as an individual have the right to access your own data, you have the right to control your own data, and you have the right to know where your own data is going to be at. And I should say as well too, that if you have questions about GDPR, or if you run in a market where GDPR, is applicable to you, certainly get the right counsel that you need, and don't rely on these two old farts to tell you what might be the right thing to do, because there's a lot of stuff in there. But even just including and understanding the idea of, am I impacted by GDPR? That's even something from a event management standpoint. That's a little bit of a gray area. The way GDPR was written, it is looking to be aimed toward companies and organizations, businesses that are actively doing business within the EU. Well,
Right.
if you are running an event, and maybe you have an event that is physically in London, then you're very clearly doing business in an EU country. But if you're running webinars or online events, and say you have a free webinar that happens to attract EU-based citizens, it's a little bit of a gray area in terms of whether or not you are actually going to need to but adhere to what GDPR regulations are requiring you to do. So there's a lot there, but I do think that again, that the takeaway is that we don't want to ignore it. Number one, we want to make sure that we're providing and allowing for people to opt out and for people to own their own data. But I would even say that it goes back to what we were just talking about a minute ago, where you are given data by people that are attending your events. Make that a two-way street. Make that something where they recognize the value that they have given you, and therefore the value that you're giving back to them. And making that a two-way street will help to alleviate the lack of trust and the questions and all of that stuff that could likely lead someone, to question, where's my data, and are you a part of a GDPR regulation or something like that.
So before I ask you about APIs and tech integrations, and maybe a thought or two that people might be thinking about, I'll just throw this out. We don't have to go in here deeply. To Aaron's point about getting counsel, I mean, that's probably a no-brainer. And depending on the size of your organization, you may be dealing with that anyway. We make that assumption a lot if we go get a subscription to Zoom or GoTo or On24 or something, because they've got to deal with all of that with regard to their own servers and all of that. And, can the individual go in and not just unsubscribe, but delete their data or whatever.
Right.
But we as a firm, because our role has very historically been with mid and larger size companies, we're entirely open and have, more times than I can count, gone through somebody's security audit. I remember the first time, it was literally 1999. First time I was working with American Express at the time. They're like, yeah, okay, we're going to fly a team out there. I'm like, what? But they wanted to see everything from our security procedures with regard to badges getting in the building and now it's just like, I mean, it was surprising then. Now it's like, bring it on if that's what you need to do, because we know we're cool. And more importantly, back to trust, right? We need to earn your trust just like you need to earn others' trust. And the good news is we've never had a negative incident. So just out of curiosity, when you're talking about integrations, sometimes we do that for clients. Sometimes we coach them with that. Just out of curiosity, is there a nugget or two there that people should be thinking about when they want to be a little more sophisticated with passing data from, into their CRM or whatever data system they're going to use?
Do it. Do it.
Okay, you
If you
heard it here
haven't,
first, folks.
do it. If you haven't done it yet, it makes a lot of sense to pull the data out and put that into a repository where you can do actionable, meaningful work with that data. So I've so many times seen companies where they have learned as they go through the value of it, and there can be a lot of value to it. The data is there. It's going to be there. We've been spending a lot of time here today talking about, why it's important and all of that. And it's almost like it's that completion, that final step to actually come up with and provide meaningful, actionable insights that the data is going to provide you. So, another thing that we were talking about a few minutes ago was, homogenizing the data so that it can exist meaningfully across platforms, so that even as something as minute as naming conventions, email address, or whatever, even something as minute as that is something that we want to think through, you want to think through, to make sure that it's working, it's not creating more headaches down the road, but it truly is homogenized across all platforms. There can be also different ways in which certain platforms are pushing the data in terms of the frequency of it. Some of the data that it's passing can be another part, in terms of like more of the more, I'd call it like metadata type data, in terms of like, duration, or if we're talking about virtual environments, the breakout sessions that they attended, or time spent at a sponsor booth, things like that. The deeper you get, the more you need to make sure that you're taking the time to homogenize that data so that it is going to be truly meaningful, to wherever and whoever is looking at it from the larger standpoint. But just do it. You really want to enable that, as a tool that is going to provide dividends to you in the future.
Yeah, to that point, we did a big project for Adobe, and this is a lot of years ago in a previous company. But one of the things that we learned by virtue of doing that project is that they coded every question.
Yes.
Right. So if you asked a question like, pick something generic, what geography are you in? If you just put that out to your team, one person says, what geography are you in? And one person says, what geo are you in? You have to go back and put that data together, as opposed to if you ask the question in exactly the same way every time. And they actually had developed a really sophisticated means of coding. But to Aaron's point about earlier about seeing the bigger picture, right? Whether that's a tech integration or you're just thinking more strategically about trends over time, it might be useful to see, to have all of that data be able to come in and go, we're seeing a trend in our attendance from EMEA.
Right.
And you're not going to know that unless you either code it right or do it right up front and kind of make that the marching orders of either your event production team or our event production team, or you're going to spend a lot of time manually messing with data, and you probably don't want to do that.
Yeah, exactly. I think where most people start when they talk about when they start thinking about that data integration, the low hanging fruit obviously is that you're expecting to pull out of it, I should say. Once you've homogenized it and all of that is standard lead scoring, segmentation of your market, and things like that, where you can start picking apart and identifying those markets. The EMEA market had, something, some sort of a positive reaction about a certain webinar, or there's higher content that's being consumed by, EMEA folks or something like that. Being able to segment out the market, either for lead scoring, so that you've got a way that you can attach values to what people are doing. And a lot of times, again, from a very basic level, that lead scoring is then, once you attach a value to it, then you attach a relative warmness to that client, if you're looking at from a sales development or sales cycle, or again, looking at finding ways to deliver meaningful content to them. So usually that's where people were going to start in terms of the very basic, kind of data intelligence 101. And you can grow up from that quite substantially. And there are, again, it's a big market. It's a lot of emphasis is being put in on a lot of different platforms about the value of your data. And Roger, as you know, we obviously spend quite a bit of time in On24, and they have recognized, to their benefit, I would say, I think they've been very smart in recognizing the value of data, and where you can produce word clouds of related content that individual attendees, for example, are likely to find interesting based on their consumption history of their past On24 events, for example. We have one financial client who we work with them to manage an integration from On24 into their larger CRM that does very, very cool things in the way of predicting and identifying who is likely, again, to resonate with specific pieces of content. And that idea, again, it's no, I feel like I'm hitting the same few points every other minute here, but it's no different, because they're just being smart about their data. That information is in there. It's that massive amount of data, but it's coming up with that intelligence to do something actionable and meaningful with it. And whether that's a tool like On24 that's going to show you the word cloud, or show you, ideas on what they're likely to resonate from a webinar or history standpoint, or if you are actually going through there and setting up rules and segments based on what your audience is doing, have at it. The data's there. That's what I think our point is in this. When I think about it, is just do it. Find ways to use that data, because they're going to be there.
I've got kind of two broad topics, and then we'll roll. One, I just want to talk about that crossing boundaries with regard to hybrid.
Yeah.
And I'll put mobile in that same bucket.
Yeah.
And then maybe, kind of wrapping up with working with others, right? How do we start to think about implementing and helping them think beyond that? But that last point that Aaron just made, I want to bring down level just a little bit, because to be fair, there are plenty of companies that don't have sophisticated AI-driven whatevers, right? And they're still going, well, wait a minute, what's some of the stuff that we can be doing? And we're talking about some of that because it's kind of leaning forward, the bleeding edge kind of stuff. But one of the things that we've done for a long time, and you can do this, or we can do it for you, so you can do this yourself, is just to start capturing all of the data points that your webinar platform captures and dropping it into a single spreadsheet, and then dropping in the next one and dropping in the next one and dropping in the data from the record. And you yourself could build out how to the capturing of all of that, even manually in a spreadsheet, to start to see trend data or that kind of thing. Right. And I just bring that up because we're in the labor outsource business. One of the key value propositions that we have is, what is the most strategic stuff you can be working on versus what's the stuff you could toss over the fence, like production work. That's what we do, right? So we've had clients for years that say, hey, you just do all the reports for us and you just send us the final report. And if you've got any insights, because you work with us for years, then send those along too. Meaning we've taken all that work off of your plate. It doesn't necessarily have to mean you need to be at that bleeding edge to really be able to take advantage of this kind of thing. So
not to gain the benefits of it, right? And again, even if you're starting at that actionable first step of lead scoring data and finding ways to segment the audience, you can do that with a spreadsheet. Just to your point, exactly. And the value of that starts to, I'm not going to say it's an exponential growth, but it absolutely starts providing value to your sales team, to your marketing team, whoever might be actually, looking at that data for an actionable follow-up with individuals.
Yeah. Well, to me, just like you mentioned, lead scoring, that's a simple one. Some platforms auto-generate that. Sometimes we go use a custom system to do that. And if, just in case that's even new to you, That just means instead of having one registration link that you start posting everywhere, you just have a customized link for each of the places. So I know I want to set it up, put it on LinkedIn. I want to put it on Twitter. I want to send it out on email, and I want to put one on my website. And I want to know where people came from when they showed up. And you can get really creative with those kinds of things, because that could go to that next level about messaging that Aaron has talked about several times, as in, hey, I tried this message and I tried this message, and that message pulled a lot better even when I used, dropped them on Twitter. Even if it could be channel, it could be message. And that's not hard. That's just a function of thinking about it and going, hey, what would be useful to me?
Right. And maybe if that exact same person on the event, if they ask the question, maybe you attach a value to that of, whatever you want to make it up of. Therefore, that person, from a metric standpoint, you're going to start to see the results of that data. If they asked a question and they stayed for 50 minutes or whatever it happens to be, maybe that extra, if they did stay full 50 minutes versus dropping off at 20 minutes, that's an indication of connectivity, that you're connecting with them. That's probably worth assigning a value to. And so it's not at all rocket science. And I appreciate you bringing that up, Roger, because certainly you can get to the point of swimming in some fairly deep waters with the bleeding edge technology of some of these things, of what they do. You don't need to do that if you are looking at the very starting point of just making better use of the data that's already there for you. So I appreciate you bringing it up. I think it's a great point.
Talk about crossing boundaries with regard to like hybrid. We've got an in-person audience. We've got an online audience, or even mobile, meaning we can't presume that everybody's sitting there in front of a browser in the same way.
Right. There's a lot there as well too. And the reason that can become a little bit of a, I'll call it a challenge, because I can't think of a better word right now, but and this is something that we've talked about, I know, in a couple other conversations we've had, is that you've got the physical. If we're talking about hybrid, and hybrid is the definition of, you've got a combination of physical attendees and then virtual attendees. By nature, by the design of your event, you've got physical attendees, you've got a big fence, a big wall, and then you've got virtual attendees on the other side of that wall. And I think some of the things that we've spent a lot of time talking through is finding ways to minimize that fence, so that you've got engagement, you've got cross-pollination of ideas, you've got networking that can happen between those two groups of people. A lot of the time that's important, because you want to make sure that you're not giving one side of the fence, a better experience, or leaving the other side of the fence, left out on an event or something like that. So those can be very, very in-depth conversations to have, thinking about a hybrid strategy. From a data standpoint, it's a little bit related, because obviously when you are in a virtual environment attending a conference, as we all know, everything you do is tracked. So what breakouts you go to, what sponsor booths you might attend, what comments you might make, all of that is tracked as a part of, usually the event platform that you're running on. It can be harder to develop similar data sets for the physical audience if they're at the Hilton and they might be deciding whether they're going to go to the networking A or networking B. It can be harder to actually gather that meaningful data. And actually, really, cell phones and mobile apps have proven to be the major catalyst for helping to tighten that up, because a lot of the platforms that we're using, and a lot of the ones that are available on the market, they have a mobile app now available for your in-person audience to ideally download. And once they've downloaded, they've signed up, obviously. So there's your registration data. That they've registered, and that they've attended. A lot of times that also then allow you to set up QR codes that, as you're going into breakout room A, you scan your QR code, for example, that then becomes like a breadcrumb trail of tracking of where your physical audience is at. And that makes it a little bit better to kind of combine those two different groups of audience. And then it also does usually provide those higher levels of networking or data consumption from a resource standpoint. So those can be very big things. And really, it, again, going back to that whole idea of having the mobile app be the catalyst and the, kind of like the bridge between those two groups of people, that really is where a lot of energy and development has gone in. Regardless, the end goal again still remains the same, where we're looking to gather meaningful, actionable data and provide and set up a way that becomes a two-way cycle. I'm sorry, a two-way street, or a a round repeating cycle with your audience. It's
Yeah.
just harder to do that physically with that audience compared to virtually, which is where you want to get smart and think about how to combine those two and how to make it work.
Yeah, I think about the things that happen in session, right? Because I mean, eh, plenty of event apps are available on mobile, and okay, when you go to the vendor section or the spot, do you scan badge? Do they give them a chance to scan badges? But I'm also thinking about the fact that mobile app, that bridge, as you put it, could allow the in-person audience to vote in a poll that
Right.
the same online audience does, or
Right.
use chat or questions or that kind of thing. Back to the idea, of course, of thinking strategically means beginning with saying, hey, well, ideally, here's what I'd love to do. Is that even
Right.
possible?
Right.
And it's pretty amazing what is possible.
Yeah. Well put.
All right,
Well put.
last topic, and we'll get you out of here. Talk about the people side of things, right? The necessity or maybe tactics for cross team planning, or, just like online audience versus in-person audience can mean siloed things, but those bridges or
Right.
those fences are breaking down. Silos inside of organizations is nothing
Yeah.
new. So I'll give you a crack at it. I'll share one case study of mine and give you final word, and we'll be done.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yes. There could, if you have stakeholders if you're working for a larger corporation or organization and you have a lot of stakeholders, obviously, um, some of the change management principles that are so widely used, or process adoption principles, are going to take precedence when you're thinking of putting this together. If you have stakeholders that have a need or a use case for the data that you are looking to use, absolutely they need to be brought into the conversation from the very beginning. And one of the things, Roger, you mentioned a few minutes when we were first starting our conversation here today, talking about the sales team, and no shade to sales, but it's very common for them to want to gather every single bit of information because it makes their lives potentially easier, and it provides better opportunity for them to be able to make the sale the more that they know about who they're going to be calling next. You have to weigh that. You have to weigh the pros and the cons with all of the different stakeholders that are going to have expectations of the system you're designing, to make sure that it's going to be the best possible system that it's going to be. And that usually means that not everybody is happy at the end. Not everybody got everything that they wanted, but you've got an actionable system. And no matter what, where the rubber hits the road, I think that you are wise to remember that the stakeholder that you need to keep most in your mind, you've got sales, you've got marketing, you've got all these other people that are bombarding you with needs and risks, or not needs and requirements and asks and things like that. The stakeholder that you need to keep in the back of your mind and advocate for is the people that own the data sets you're looking to gather, is the people that you are looking to bring into and get into your events, because ultimately you're the one that's going to be building that conversation and that relationship. And you've got your head above water enough to know that, like we've been talking about here today, it's not a one-time deal. It's a relationship that you build up. And so I think you need to come into this from a standpoint of advocating for the people that you're going to want to have attend your event, and make sure that technically, or quote unquote, their voice is heard and developed so that it's respected as well, as much as sales or marketing or anybody else that might want to look at that data is.
Yeah, it's not uncommon not only to see silos in organizations, but then finger pointing, right? Marketing's going, hey, we sent them a bunch of leads and they didn't call them. And sales is like, man,
Right.
you're sending us crap, or whatever, whatever the issue is. Here's the one case study. And I just throw this out there because it worked so well one time that I hope it gives you an idea or two. A company was doing a new product release, version 7.5 was upgrading to 8. And the thing that we did was to split it out into 8. It was instead of just doing one 1 hour kind of here's our big new launch thing, we split it out into 8 different sessions, and the presentation portion focused on a different segment of the release. And so we had 8 topics instead of 1. And then, but the presentation then was like 15, 20 minutes. It was supposed to be short, and then said, okay, ask anything Q&A. And they brought sales engineers in to then just literally take live Q&A, typed Q&A, whatever. And I think they mostly did typed. They took some live just because it was really engaging. But the whole point was, and we worked this out with the chief revenue officer in advance, and that part of how we had the buy-in. But the Q&A data was fed to the sales team after each of the sessions so that they could follow up with a warm call going, hey, looks like you attended our event. And you asked, should we have pizza for dinner? Was the question answered, or just curious, was there a question behind the question? And the whole point was now they're following up not as the salesperson, but as a friend, right? As a true solution kind of relationship in a way that really built trust. But I've also seen that go down in flames when somebody says, hey, we got more than just the registration data. Let's put that all into salesforce.com or whatever CRM. And sales teams go like, what the heck's all this?
Yeah.
Right. So the program had to be, hey, here's what we're going to be doing. And in this case, they had sponsorship of the chief revenue officer who said, this is what you're going to be doing. And this was, of course, for the inside team as opposed to the outside sales team. But the whole point being, you could break down that silo, earn trust, and improve how they do that. And as you might imagine, we weren't very many events in before they're starting to think, oh, what questions do we want to make sure that are getting put out there into a form of polling, or the way that the sales engineer was the same sales engineer each time who just was super smart. And he would start guiding how he would get people to type stuff into chat, because now that chat became part of their actionable stuff, because I knew, oh, hey, Aaron, looks like you attended our event and asked, are we having pizza for dinner? And now I've got a meaningful in that was something that we know was meaningful to you. Right? Not everybody asked about pizza for dinner. Aaron asked about pizza for dinner. And now there's, oh, you're actually paying attention to me. And that's a really key part of trust. And
it is.
And it was a real powerful something that frankly anybody can do, because none of this was talking about AI or data integrations or anything like that. It's just about being a little more purposeful up front, saying, hey, how do we really connect with people?
Right. Right. Yeah. I think it's natural for people to be distrustful in our climate right now, of companies and what their intentions are for data. I think naturally there are headwinds because a little bit because it's especially with AI, and that's something that we've hit on a couple of times here and there, especially with predictability of analytics and of data sets that businesses are now using. I think it's natural that there is a level of probably healthy distrust in a lot of people in terms of getting these informational solicitations and stuff back from companies. And so you do have headwinds. And so it does go back to that whole idea, marketing 101, we're building relationships. We're not necessarily selling a product. We're not necessarily trying to convince someone. we're building a relationship, and that doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't necessarily happen on the first webinar, or even maybe even the 8th or the 10th. But to your point, and I think you're spot on, Roger, the more you build up that relationship, the more you're providing that value back to them, the better off you're going to be with whatever your message or your product or your communications are going to be. That's just that natural ability where people recognize they're giving you their data and they're getting back something meaningful from you. And they're going to be much more willing to continue that conversation with you and build that relationship. I think that's the key all the way around.
Yeah. Well, and you know what? Here as we close, you can probably see where our hearts are. There are certainly people who use webinars in the context, or virtual events in the context of transactional things, right? How do we drive people there and get them to buy something right on? That's not our world generally, right? We're working with clients. At least our world is B2B, and I'm just going to look right into the camera and say, the currency that we trade in is trust, for so many reasons, right? Because if we're not your trusted partner, you don't come back. And the good news is, we would hope that we have a shot at being one of those conversations where years from now you're going, yep, man, that was one of the best partnerships I've had over the years. And true story, one of our longest term clients been with us more than 10 years, just doing the same thing over and over and over, because we're just an extension of the team. Right. And so with that, Aaron, any final thought?
No, thank you for your time.
We've covered some territory today, so
we did, yeah. Well, actually, one thought that I was thinking about actually before our call here today was, I love this topic. I think it's one of those topics that it's not going to go away. It's not going to become less important. It's going to grow in more and more importance. And as we've had all of our conversations like this, it's interesting to me how, we've had various topics of things. And the more we talk, the more you start to realize how interconnected all of these different elements actually are. And they build that eventually you start to see that much more cohesive product, or not product, but that much more cohesive picture of the market and of your relationship with your clients and your market that you're looking to build. Data intelligence is obviously one of those very big things. And if you're not doing it, you should do it, even if it is from the very beginning of just finding that first step of consolidating your data and homogenizing that so that you are able to do meaningful analysis, lead score, tracking, segmentation. Definitely worth your time to do. So I hope it was certainly hope it was helpful.
Well, as always, and you probably saw this up front, Aaron at virtualvenues.com is how you get to the boss. And we like to think that we're big enough to serve the biggest companies in the world, because we do, and small enough to just keep it real and personal and relational. And that means we will take your phone call, and we're here to help. So with that, Aaron, thanks again I'm always amazed at how much stuff you've got in your head. So that's really awesome to hang with you again on this version of V2's Thought Leader Conversations. We will see each and every one of you for the next one next time around. See you next week.